and East Asia as the first keynote speaker.
Good morning. Prime Minister Kovachevsky, Finance Minister Bissimi, ministers of the government of North Macedonia, colleagues from other international organizations, think tanks, and academia, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to join you for the Skopje Economic Finance Forum, and this time in person. I very much enjoyed being with you for the first time you held the event last year, and I'm very glad to see that you're doing this as an annual event. It's also great to speak among such distinguished guests, including Paul Krugman. Today, countries across the Europe and Central Asia region face a myriad of new economic headwinds and challenges at a time when they should be making a resilient recovery from the pandemic. As such, this conference couldn't come at a better time. Governments have the tough job of helping their countries buffer the socioeconomic impacts of major crises, which today include the devastating war in Ukraine, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, weather extremes, high inflation, and rising energy and food prices. This conference provides an excellent opportunity to learn from each other's experiences and reflect on how best to design and implement effective and sustainable policies that not only respond to the crises, but also support development goals in the medium and long term. The Western Balkans have felt the full impact of the increasing frequency and magnitude of external shocks. Legacy development challenges are now closely intertwined with adjusting to the economic consequences of the war in Ukraine, responding to the longer-term impacts of the pandemic, and managing the impacts of climate change. We have been taken aback by the speed with which inflation has returned in recent months, a result of disruptions in trade and supply chains, price surges in energy, food, and commodities, and a deglobalization of economic activities. Worldwide, we see an increase in socioeconomic fragility and instability. At the World Bank, we recently summarized the current socioeconomic context and implication to these crises on the region in our Spring 2022 Economic Update for Europe and Central Asia and our Western Balkans Regular Economic Report. With many of you, we discussed the key messages, data, and policy recommendations of these reports during the spring meetings in Washington last month. Our overall recommendation is that policymakers need to be better equipped to handle future crises as part of a comprehensive approach to bolstering resilient, inclusive, and greener development. This includes fortifying macroeconomic policy buffers and institutions to strengthen stability, promoting greater inclusion, reinforcing social protection systems to protect the most vulnerable, keep focusing on improving energy efficiency and a green transition to secure a more sustainable future. I look forward to being part of this conference and seeing how the World Bank can help governments employ the most impactful, inclusive, and sustainable approaches to economic policies during this tumultuous period. Amidst these challenges, governments must balance a commitment to fiscal sustainability while also protecting the most vulnerable from damaging long-term impacts. As finance ministers in the audience, you're keenly aware of the extent to which fiscal space has been exhausted. Public debt levels have risen and macro-fiscal consolidation challenged by unexpected and critical crisis responses not foreseen in the budget. After several rounds of crisis response, increased focus will have to be placed on structural constraints that have hindered the creation of high-skilled jobs. And the proper balance among macro-fiscal consolidation, environmental and economic sustainability, and social inclusion requires a renewed focus on overcoming entrenched structural obstacles. Better conditions are needed for firms to invest, create employment, and boost entrepreneurship, innovation, and activity, especially among high levels of unemployed youth. Here in North Macedonia, for example, this means ensuring greater transparency and efficiency of the justice sector, state aid reform to crowd in private sector investments, human capital development to align skills to the needs of a 21st century economy, and financial sector development with a focus on green and innovative instruments and financing. A green transition needs collaboration across existing divides, both nationally and regionally, with a shared view to encourage innovations in climate-smart agriculture, digitalization, and artificial intelligence, as well as the generation and trade of renewable energy. There are joint objectives among and within countries to provide clean energy and protect natural resources, including water from contamination and exhaustion. Never have the actions taken today been more important for the foundations for future prosperity. I would like to reconfirm the World Bank's commitment to supporting and reinforcing the structural foundations for a green, resilient, and inclusive development. This is a complex challenge requiring vision and courage to overcome economic obstacles and bring different perspectives around the same vision. We often hear, never waste a crisis. The time period ahead has many uncertainties, but it does also provide an important opportunity to change the direction of the policy agenda and to accelerate the implementation of more innovative reforms that generate faster and higher growth. I look forward to building on our already substantial work program of investments and analytical work in the region. I have no doubt that this conference will provide essential input to weathering the storms and to provide inspiration in support of economic growth models that bring poverty reduction and greater sustainability. With these words, I thank you very much and wish you all the best for the conference.
Our second keynote speaker is the EU Commissioner for Budget and Administration, Mr. Johannes Hahn, who will address us via video message.
Ladies and gentlemen, challenging times require conferences like yours with inspiring debates, thinking the unthinkable, followed by also doing the unthinkable. Therefore, I would have liked to join you in Skopje to discuss how we can sustain growth in times of uncertainty. As this is unfortunately not possible, I would like to highlight two elements which are key to counter uncertainty: joint political will and foresight. The combination of both helped Europe to find an adequately unprecedented answer to the unprecedented challenges we are facing: the war against Ukraine as well as the COVID crisis. The stimulus package of more than 2 trillion euro is an excellent example of our joint political will. While it took 8 years to recover from the previous financial crisis, the EU economy was rebounding already last year from the pandemic recession, faster than expected. This is also thanks to the 800 billion euro firepower of the temporary recovery instrument Next Generation EU, which we used to boost the long-term budget. Next Generation EU symbolizes not only our political will, but also our vision to make Europe fit for the future by anticipating the crucial transformations. The priorities we set with Next Generation EU are now more important than ever. The Green Deal and digitalization will enable us to come stronger out of the pandemic and to withstand the impact of the war against Ukraine. In particular, the Green Deal serves as a sustainable growth strategy and job-creating engine. Meeting the 2030 climate and energy targets can add 1% of GDP and create almost 1 million new green jobs. It will benefit households as well as small and medium businesses. At the same time, the recovery and resilience plans use the innovative power of transition to make us more independent from oil and gas. We share this sustainable growth strategy also with our partners, like Northern Macedonia. The economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans reflects this by supporting the long-term economic recovery of the region based on green and digital transition. This also brings the region closer to the EU single market. I am convinced that our future lies in European cooperation and integration, including the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe. This is the moment to shape our common future with political will and vision. Therefore, I am very looking forward to the ideas this conference will develop, and I wish you many inspiring discussions.
Introducing the first panel debate, Navigating Fiscal and Monetary Policies, which will be moderated by Mr. Zoran Jovanovski and Mr. Vladimir Šimić. Professor of Economics at the Faculty of Economics, Business and Tourism in Split, Croatia.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I was just informed and asked by the organizers to excuse the Prime Minister Kovachevsky as he had to leave due to other obligations. Following the excellent speeches, now it is time for the first panel of the conference titled Navigating Fiscal and Monetary Policies as a part of Pillar 1, Macroeconomic Challenges in Turbulent Times. Last night, while I was finalizing the preparations for today's panel, the TV 1000 channel was airing The Big Short, a movie about the global financial crisis in 2008. I hope that it was not an omen, but in any case, it was a reminder about the crisis management mode we have all been practicing ever since, be it because of the sovereign debt crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, etc. Along that line, here we are today. Prevailing economic circumstances are rather gloomy. The diagnostics show substantial slowdown of the post-COVID-19 economic recovery, inflation at a pace unseen for decades, coming mostly from the supply side, possible shortage of food and excessively expensive energy, war on European soil and risk of further military escalations, limited fiscal space for further government interventions, great amount of uncertainty about the future, growing number of people who live below the poverty line, declining prices of shares on the stock exchanges threatening to impact the investors' sentiment and consumers' confidence, and differences in the developments in the economies in different parts of the world. So, how to cope with all this? Should we all seek solutions individually, country by country, or there is a need for international cooperation and coordination? Within the individual countries, what is the available arsenal of economic instruments for this battle for recovery and economic growth? What is the role of individual macroeconomic policies, the fiscal policy, the monetary policy, who should be doing what and how? The priorities must be to secure having food on the table, to secure having energy for the next winter's heating and for production purposes, to keep the economy running, and to preserve the economic future of the next generations by not overburdening them with government debt. One thing is for sure, this is not the best of times to be responsible for the conduct of the fiscal policy or monetary policy. There is a great amount of responsibility on the shoulders. There were supposed to be two separate panels, one related to the fiscal policy and one to the monetary policy, but they were merged into one, so we go as one panel. And today we have a group of very distinguished panelists, ministers of finance, a governor, representatives of the IMF, and of the academic community. But before we start the discussions, I would like to invite Professor Šimić from Croatia, with whom we will jointly moderate the panel, to give his introductory views. Vladimir.
Thank you, Zoran. Welcome all. Welcome, dear panelists. Let me just provide a short introduction to the topic that we will discuss today. Inflation has been rising recently, dramatically even so. and the whole world is faced now with inflation. How worried should we be about it? What can and should be done about it? What can and what should central banks do about it? Apparently, these are very important questions. And this also relates to the question what the appropriate role for monetary policy is. Let me put our today's topic into a somewhat broader context. I think if we look back at the 20th century, monetary theory and the associated analysis of the role of a central bank in an economy has been one of the most dynamic and interesting fields in economic theory, with the most important developments coming in the second half of the 20th century. One might say by the end of the century, a consensus was achieved what successful monetary policy consisted of. In short, the central banks should focus on price stability, there should be central bank independence in place, and monetary policy can play a stabilization role, but only in the short run. But then, in the 21st century, as we've heard before, we have witnessed a more activist monetary policy, playing a stabilization role and fighting against the financial and economic crisis. I don't have to remind you of the crisis in 2008, 2009, global financial crisis. Another crisis hit the world economy with the COVID-19 pandemics, and the most recently, the war in Ukraine, unfortunately. This more activist role of monetary policy meant unconventional measures for monetary policy, extremely low interest rates, historically low interest rates, quantitative easing, etc. One question has to be posed, though. Was it too much? Should we be surprised that we have witnessed the recent inflation? Maybe it is about the time that we remind ourselves of some forgotten lessons. And as a reminder, I will quote Milton Friedman, another Nobel laureate, from his 1968 seminal paper on the role of monetary policy. Quote, "We are in danger of assigning to monetary policy a larger role than it can perform, in danger of asking it to accomplish tasks that it cannot achieve, and as a result, in danger of preventing it from making the contribution that it is capable of making." I think this quote puts a nice framework for our discussion, at least regarding the monetary policy to discuss today. So with this, I will finish my introduction, and we will hear from our panelists. Zoran.
So before we start with the discussion, let me point out that for simplicity reasons, we will initially have one round of questions and answers, and each panelist will have 7 minutes to provide an answer. The time is shown on the screen, so I hope that we will manage to this properly with having in mind the number of panelists. So we start with Minister Besimi. In the post-COVID-19 economic recovery period, what was the single policy move made by your institution that you consider to be the most effective, and why? And in addition, what is to be done for the period to come, given the circumstances that we face and the uncertainty? And in particular, one aspect that is to be discussed a bit, the coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy is of utmost importance in the current circumstances. So in your view, how to coordinate the two policies in the forthcoming period and obtain optimal outcome from a macroeconomic point of view? Please.
Thank you, Zoran. Difficult question to reply in one single answer, but let's put like this. We have a basket or a pillow that it takes years to put flies on it, catch them and put on it. And it suddenly, it breaks, or somewhere you get a scarf and it opens. And it's not only that, it's windy. We have all this situation, and now I understand the question, how we put this again on track. It's very, very difficult. But what we know at this time, actually, we know the direction of the wind. At least we know about the strength of the wind. And most of all, we know the implications. of this for our economy. But there are many unknowns, many uncertainties. We don't know if there will be a thunder, if there will be a rain again. So this is where we are now in terms of the situation that we face. And by saying this, I'm not trying to say that this should sound pessimistic. You just want to make aware, to raise the awareness of the uncertainties that we face and the circumstances or the context that we have to deal with policies. And there are many good news, and the good news compared to the financial crisis, in the COVID crisis, we saw that there has been a fast reaction, more coordinated, and it was the fiscal stimulus much stronger. And actually, after the 2020, we saw 21 recovery in our country as well, but also in globally talking about this. So this is a positive sign. And what we did during the COVID, and now there were several packages, strong communication with the business community and academia. And also internationally, we had a very close cooperation in IFIs, international financial institutions, and a lot of advice. And actually, there was like, from the unknown, what the COVID is and what are the implications, we came to a more synchronized approach globally. And we did the same in our country. But what are the consequences? The consequences is higher public debt, higher deficits. And when we thought that we will do the recovery in 2021, 22 and on, we just face another crisis. And this another crisis comes when we are exhausted. And we already have a lower fiscal space than before. And on this context now we see that something, and also it was mentioned from Professor Fugman, you know, we didn't talk 2 years ago before the COVID about supply chains globally. And actually now we see that this disruption is also becoming an obstacle for the economy to follow the demand. We see that after the COVID, a lot of financial fiscal stimulus was there, and with expectation that the supply will follow this demand. And what we are facing now, there are a few challenges on the supply side. One is this disrupted supply chain. The second is our commitment globally about green growth and a lot of investment needed there, but also in the price. And the third is geostrategical, and something that we see how globally the world moves in terms of the global powers, economic and strategic. And what no one expected is the war. And from this perspective, what we thought will be a recovery happened that we faced that supply cannot follow this demand. And in the markets, we see not only that demand is higher than supply in the financial markets talking, but we also see the investors are a bit more cautious. And you face the liquidity issue because they are more cautious on where they are going to invest. So this is the additional challenge. So what we thought that we can recover now in terms of fiscal, but also in terms of the private sector, it will cost much more. And the biggest now the challenge is how we face this with more expensive finances and how we are going to reply to all this. Trying to come to yours, very simplified question to come to one answer. And what is here is we did continue with the fiscal support. It's something that we cannot avoid, but we redesign it, and actually it should be more targeted and more timely. And also in terms of the market, the general measures need to reduce. So this is what in the future would look like the fiscal support. So, and very close cooperation with the central bank. We see that this is also happening in our economy. So this is what we are trying to support vulnerable categories, businesses that are more directly affected from this, and try to phase out these policies that are generalized. So we create more space for targeted policies. And what is critical in this period, we should not lose the focus, the midterm and long-term focus. That's growth. And this is the topic of this conference, sustaining growth in times of uncertainty and beyond. we must keep that track. And during this period, we have to make sure that we work on the green transition, energy efficiency, because it's going to be a big challenge this year and next. Also, we have to work on digitalization that makes more competitive our economy. And third, also human capital. Infrastructure, of course, is part of this trade and connectivity. And what is coming, we have to make sure, I noticed what you were saying, we should make sure that there is food on our tables and there is heating during the winter. So meanwhile, we work and create more income for private sector, for citizens, so getting ready for what is coming. And I think there are solutions. If you are asking me in one answer, yes, there are possible solutions. If we come, all of us understand the size and of the crisis and look on the opportunities ahead. So
it's good to keep the optimism in any case.
Thank you, Mr. Bassimi. Next, we have our next speaker, that is Governor Bejosko. Welcome. Have a couple of questions for you. Assuming that the largest part of the recent inflation is due to supply-side shocks and higher energy and food prices, what can and should the central banks do about it? In addition to that, in an environment possibly characterized by a combination of low growth and simultaneous inflation, and with the countries employing fiscal measures to avoid recession, what is the scope for coordination between monetary and fiscal policy? And if the central banks will have to fight against inflation with stronger increases in interest rates, feasibly generating a recession, and the fiscal authorities decide to fight the potential recession with yet another round of expansionary policies, do you think that the central bank independence might be endangered? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much first for the invitation to be part of this event together with many distinguished panelists and speakers. So concerning inflation, I think we heard a lot about what is the story practically. If we can clearly say that after a decade of persistently low inflation and challenges of many central banks to reach the inflation targets, last year these trends were reversed. We started seeing inflation picking up, and one of the most important factors being the supply-side shocks, which in some economies have been also combined with the demand pressures, resulting in mismatch between the supply and demand. What is the result of these trends? In April, if we look at the most recent data, inflation across the board in all economies has significantly increased, reaching historic highs. For example, in Central and Southeastern Europe, on average, it is 11.5%. In our case, in Macedonian case, inflation has also picked up, reaching 10.5% in April. Practically, why is inflation picking up in our economy? We're a very small economy with highest trade openness in the region of Western Balkan and the fifth largest openness in the Central and Southeastern Europe. Additional factor is the composition, where, for example, in our case, about half of our consumption basket consists of food and energy in comparison, for example, with the Eurozone, when it's about 30%. So the same shock is propagated more strongly in our case. So although the supply shocks are playing the main role in this setting, though it's clear that they will not, although they usually last shorter and are usually contained to a set of consumption items, what is happening now is completely different. Obviously, it will not last so short as we expected, and obviously it is having a more broad-based effect over the consumption basket. On average, in emerging economies, half of the consumption basket is having a high inflation. So to the extent that the inflation lasts longer and is more widespread it can negatively affect inflationary expectations. De facto, the latest survey of the European Commission on inflationary expectations in Central and Southeastern Europe clearly point that inflationary expectations have picked up. Though, positive side of this is that it is mostly referred to the short-term inflationary expectations, as Professor Krugman also mentioned. In the segment of the long-term inflationary expectations, still expectations are more moderate, so which also may go back to the progress which was made in the last decade, where worldwide inflationary expectations became better entrenched, so that they reacted less to the inflation surprises. In this context, many central banks, as we already discussed, have started the tightening cycle because practically they do not have much room for maneuver. Of course, inflationary expectations in the medium term are not a problem of that size at this point, but we have to react not to come to the point when medium-term inflationary expectations will put additional pressures. So what is important is that the moves of the central bank are well communicated and gradual, having in mind all this uncertainty, and that they do not create additional shocks to the financial markets. It provides some room for the fiscal policy to adjust. So in this context, we as a central bank have also started normalization of our monetary policy with a couple of increases of interest rate, but also using other instruments, having in mind that we are pursuing not an inflation targeting strategy, but strategy of targeting the exchange rate. So now the other side of the medal, yes, we have started the normalization of the policy because we are seeing inflation picking up. And one aspect that I forgot to mention concerning the inflationary expectation, main risk is that it's become more backward-looking and affects the wage-setting process. This is key element that we all should be aware of this, because if we start seeing more abrupt pressures on the demand side coming from the wage side, this will even make life of the central banks more complicated than anyway it is. Of course, the other side is slowing down of the economy, so these shocks are creating upward pressure for inflation by downward pressure from the growth. And now the challenge for the policymakers how to respond, because of course they are again called, like in the period of pandemics, to react. Now, unfortunately, the setting is completely different. First of all, both policies have less room for maneuver. And second, now we are functioning in an environment when inflation is picking up, unlike the pandemic's period when the inflation was low and the central banks were able to adjust and accommodate to the fiscal needs to support the growth. And such accommodative monetary policy at that time was not at odds with the price stability because there were no such pressures. Now, the environment is completely different, which means that we need to have a different division of labor this time. Fiscal policy, as Minister already mentioned, clearly have to focus on clear priorities, given that the room for fiscal policy has significantly narrowed. And plus, additional aspect, over-expansionary fiscal policy can create even more pressures and more challenges for the central bank to tame the inflationary expectations. On the other hand, monetary policy or central banks do not have other options but clearly focusing on monetary stability, on price stability, because eventually this is the best contribution that the central banks can give, as without macroeconomic and price stability, we cannot at all speak for any medium-term growth prospect. And Minister well mentioned, we are now extinguishing fires, but we should not lose sight of the structural issues, because in the long term, the growth can be stimulated not by the monetary policies. They can play, in general, supporting role, but they cannot play the main role in supporting the growth. And increasing the growth potential, practically, it will be a very important mechanism to help the consolidation of the fiscal policy in the medium term and building, again, buffers that we need at any future point, because now we are dealing with the war, pandemics, but eventually in the future there will be new types of crises and we'll need to have buffers for them. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your answer. I'm really glad to hear that you are talking to the minister, and I think it will be really a high responsibility for both of you to work on this, and I think it will not be only a challenge for North Macedonia, but for all of the countries in the region. So that responsibility stays with us, and I think it cannot be overemphasized. So.
Okay, we go back to the fiscal policy now. The next question is for Mrs. Delina Ibrahimai, who is Minister of Finance and Economy of Albania. In principle, with all the ministers, we go with the same structure of question, where we have a brief, let's say, address on what worked well in the past, what is expected to be done in the future, and then there is also one additional element. In the case of Albania, Albania is one of the 3 countries included in the so-called Open Balkan Initiative. And how do you look at the regional cooperation, and especially at this initiative at the time of the current crisis, but also in general? How do you assess the impact of the regional cooperation through the Open Balkan Initiative on the fiscal policy of Albania? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I will start by thanking the Minister Vesimi for organizing such an interesting event in these times, and making us sitting in this panel and discussing about common issues. Maybe the public will listen to the same problems, will listen to the same solutions, because we are alike countries and we all have similarities in our fiscal policies, in our monetary policies, in our challenges for development. And this is the reason why I will start by the end, and then I will go to the first question. This is the reason why the regional collaboration is so important. We are all small economies, and by having different policies, by having different infrastructural goals, by having geographical divisions, we believe that all the different policies are an impediment to growth. We should all work together, and we should all work into improving market efficiency, into improving our trade together, into liberalizing our the 4 freedoms, so the freedom of capital, the freedom of the movement of capital, the movement of people, the movement of trade, of goods and services. And this is what we are aiming by different initiatives. It started with the Berlin process, and it's continuing with the Open Balkans process. We are trying to better integrate, to increase market efficiency, to increase trade between us, to go towards the benefits of globalization. And these are also all pillars of European integration. So what we are doing is trying to speed up the process and getting ready for the EU integration process. It's very difficult to assess the impact of this collaboration, and it's difficult to assess the impact of the fiscal policies. But nevertheless, within the Open Balkans initiatives, we are trying to, and we will sign a memorandum soon in Ohrid, next week. We are trying to align and to discuss on the fiscal policies that we will implement in the future. Now I'm going to go back to what happened in the last years and how are we facing with the current crisis. But we don't have to forget that the regionalization, the globalization is part of the solution of the problems that we are facing now. Albania, differently from the other countries here in the panel, had another crisis. We had an earthquake, a terrible earthquake in 2019, and right after that we had the pandemics. The policy responses to the pandemics were a mix of monetary and fiscal policies. So on the one hand, the central bank eased further the monetary policy by lowering interest rate from 1 to 0.5%. And they also deferred some loan payments in order for the businesses to have enough liquidity for their business continuity. On the other side, the fiscal policies of the government deferred tax payments, of course, provided subsidies to businesses and to employment in order to contain the effects of the stopping of the economy. We also provided sovereign guarantees for businesses in order for them to have enough liquidity for business continuity. And what happened with this mix of policies, but also never to forget, with the flexibility of the businesses that are operating in Albania, is that very soon, right in the last quarter of 2020, we reached to have a positive growth of GDP. And then in 2021, we increased the fiscal stimulus by increasing the investments, the amount of investments that we were supplying to the country, also because of the reconstruction processes. And it all translated into a growth of 8.5% in 2021. And differently from other countries in the region, last year we didn't have high inflation. The first signs of inflation started this year, at the beginning of this year, and still we have a lower inflation than the rest of the countries. In April, as it was said, even if the numbers of inflation are higher, if we look at monthly inflation, it is starting to decrease the growth path. So we also believe that this will be a temporary crisis. Definitely the prices will continue to stay upper than they were before the crisis, but we believe that in the second part of the year they will continue they will start to decrease. The issues and the major challenges that we have for the moment is continuing to supply the fiscal stimulus that it is foreseen in our budget by, of course, reducing the debt and by trying to invest in those areas and in those sectors that will provide growth and will affect the macroeconomic levels for the future. Another challenge is the provision of energy. Albania has only hydro production, so we don't have the challenge of the green energy production, but we have the challenge of the higher costs. We have decided that we will cover for all the increased cost of energy in order not to increase the cost of production and not to increase the level of consumption, so not to affect the level to decrease the level of consumption, so not to affect the level of consumption. These are the challenges that we face now, but I believe that through all the discourses that we will have during this panel today, I hope to be enlightened and to share the experiences and to be able to face this whole new challenge altogether. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is really interesting that there is so much enthusiasm by Open Balkan Initiative. I'm also involved in that from the chamber, and I think that's the right way to go. We continue with Mr. Murati from Kosovo, who is Minister of Finance, Labor and Transfers. Basically the same type of question, what worked well, because we want to learn from the experiences, our mutual experiences here, and what is to be done for the future. But also along those lines, in particular, in a times of major crisis, the expenditure side of the state budget is facing significant pressures for the expenditures to be increased in order to alleviate the impact of the crisis on the economic agents. So, in essence, there are three ways to respond to these pressures. One is not to increase budget expenditures. Another is to increase the budget expenditures and finance them by foreign borrowing. And the third way is to increase the budget expenditures, but to try to finance that by increasing the revenues through reducing the gray economy. So how could this be achieved? What is the experience of Kosovo in, let's say, combating the informal sector and trying through that channel to make the conduct of the fiscal policy easier?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll start with the last one and then go again through the general question. Regarding the revenue versus the expenditure side, we didn't have that much of a pressure actually last year. We've had a very impressive economic growth of 10.5% for the past year. I know we started off of a lower base, but regardless, also in nominal terms, it's way higher. And this allowed us to generate additional revenues because economic activity was higher, and that made us not stop. I mean, we still launched informality, or the fight against informal economy. We launched measures to actually curb informal economy and to reduce it. And as a result of the economic growth, but also other measures, we achieved an increase in revenue collection by about a third without changing any tax policy. So more than 30% increase last year. And the trend is actually continuing this year. Year to date, we have 19% higher revenues compared to the previous year. So it is quite important to also undertake necessary measures to fight informality. And this also allowed us, because it was previously mentioned, the debt to GDP levels and so on, relative to our GDP, actually our debt decreased by 0.5 percentage point last year because it grew but slower than the GDP growth rate. And coming off of a 7% of GDP deficit from the previous year, we came down to 1.4% deficit level. What we undertook is, well, first of all, as a new government last year, when I took office, I believe there were some expectations in the business community that there was going to be some sort of a tax or fiscal amnesty. And we had to clear that out of the room immediately. We had to go out and say that there's not going to be such a thing. We are going to help businesses, we are going to help employees, but nobody will be forgiven what they owe. And I think that created this momentum where businesses actually, those who were holding out, the larger businesses, some of them who were holding out in the hopes of having an amnesty, started paying the taxes. But we also worked toward increasing the fiscalization of the economy in general. So we were quite aggressive in that. Our main target, was considering that most of the informal economy is happening to the smaller side of businesses. Our main target was actually the undeclared work rather than going straight after the revenues. Because by making sure that all of the employees are declared, first of all, you have better rights for the employees because they have a contract and they can complain whenever their rights are not being respected. But also that creates a pressure to better declare revenues as well, because you cannot have a business declaring, let's say, 5,000 euros a month in salaries, while at the same time declaring 4,000 euros a month in revenues, because that would be a loss-making business. And on top of that, what we've started this year is to have this mandatory personal income tax declaration, where everybody who has had or who has generated additional income during the year, aside from the salary which is taxed at the source, the tax is being withheld, has to declare their income and to pay taxes on it. The laws did exist before, but the mechanism was not necessarily the best one. It was quite complicated and very difficult to actually do such a declaration. So we started by simplifying it, and we are going to see how this will develop this year, and then continue to improve upon it. What I must say is that everything is digital, so going with the digital and efficiency is quite important. That should be the main, so to say, theme of any new initiative of our governments. And yeah, well, going back to what we did and going off of digital, post-pandemic actually now means at least two crises. We've had first the inflationary pressures late last year, and then we've had also the war in Ukraine, which further exacerbated those pressures by reducing the export levels of grain and sunflower oil, but also gas and oil in general. So what we did is first we had the coming out of the pandemic situation where actually the economies were shut down and demand was basically almost non-existent. So we had to basically intervene to save jobs and regenerate that demand in order for the economic cycle to not break. And that package was to the tune of about 6% of GDP, and it had 5 pillars. The first pillar was to save jobs and get people back on jobs. Second pillar was to direct support to businesses to increase their production capacities, but also their export capacities. The third pillar was support for households, those who were most in need, like social assistance receivers or pension receivers. The fourth pillar was improvement of public services, making them more efficient, more digital. And the fifth one was infrastructure. So better infrastructure, but also better environmental infrastructure in the sense of also investing in new technologies, but in more efficient infrastructure as well. And the second package has to do with the most recent development, the war in Ukraine, and the higher inflationary pressures. And I think there the challenge was, as with any country, how to intervene to support those most in need without further deteriorating the inflationary environment. So what we did is we had basically two sides of the book or of the page. And on one side, we intervened by subsidizing electricity costs because we didn't want that to be an excuse to increase prices in the business and in the economy and to pass them on to the consumer. And we also subsidized the excise tax for agriculture as well, so that we reduce any inflationary pressure on the domestic production. And on the other hand, we also provided a package which was about 1.4% of GDP to support those most in need. So basically pensioners, social assistance receivers, students, but also all employees in the public and private sector receiving less than €1,000 a month. So these are, so to say, those packages and those interventions that we made. And I believe energy will be a challenge, will continue to be a challenge, but since my time is up, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. From what you said, it sounds that Kosovo made a good progress and good moves in the current adverse environment. We will complete the discussion with the Ministers of Finance, with Mr. Damjanovic, the Minister of Finance from Montenegro. Unfortunately, he was not able to come here, but it's my understanding that he provided a video message. In the prior correspondence with him, what I tried to ask him was the fact that Montenegro has already started the EU accession negotiations, whether he finds that important for the fiscal policy, and are there any specific benefits from having the negotiations started for the capacity and potential of the fiscal policy? But I don't know what is his response in the video message. So I would kindly ask the organizers to put on.
Distinguished participants of the conference, dear colleagues and dear friends, I would kindly share my sincere thanks to our host, organizers from North Republic of Macedonia. In addition, I'm grateful for the opportunity to give a few video remarks at this prestigious gathering. I hope that you all understand my absence from Skopje, which was last-minute necessity due to obligation that I had with Montenegrin Parliament today. Considering the importance of regional cooperation and its strengthening, which is a key condition for EU stabilization and accession process, I am highly interested in the conference topics and your guests' respective expertise, which are jointly more than capable to deliver strong response to a number of challenges for our countries and our region. Fiscal challenges remain persistent for all of our countries because the recovery from COVID, which just initiated in the second half of last year, shifted downward when energy and food prices spikes required restructuring of reform agenda, both for Montenegro as well as the region. Furthermore, from February, and potentials for mild recovery additionally deteriorate after aggression of Russia Federation on Ukraine. There are more than one arguments that global crisis has speeded up. Challenges from energy, oil, and foods markets could limit joint efforts to provide for uninterrupted chain of supply to our citizens. Additionally, inflation, for which we believe that has become a solid topic on the Balkans, now gains global moment and could endanger all public policies with focus on monetary and fiscal particularly, which in consequence could shift the burden of crisis on most sensitive groups, retired, unemployed, and social networks beneficiaries. Therefore, key task for all of us has become only one, to create and implement sustainable fiscal measures, which will adequately address burning challenges which threatens the global economy everywhere, but most likely will strongly influence winter in Europe and our region. Let us work so this does not become devastating in its consequences. If we succeed, our EU agenda will be more than promised on a horizon. I am confident that these conferences' objectives will provide us with tools to prove our commitments toward EU, as well as our willingness to strengthen cooperation between our countries and, more importantly, our economies. Let us enhance economic links, share experience, and connect to overcome this crisis in order to create regional initiative, why not Open Balkan Initiative, which will jointly structure agenda to fight the dire consequences of this crisis while remaining in service of preserving and increasing living standard of our citizens, as well as implementing innovative development agenda with our international friends. In hope that next time my schedule will be more flexible, I promise to use every opportunity to meet you and talk with all of you on mentioned and every other topics. I wish you the best, and I know that you will have successful roundup of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you for the message. We will hear next from Ms. Stephanie Evelyn, IMF resident representative to the regional office for the Western Balkans. Ms. Evelyn, central banks are signaling interest rates rises are coming soon, or as you've heard in some countries already there. Will inflation be brought under control? What do you think? And in addition, if the negative inflation trends persist and the world experiences prolonged increases in interest rates, how fragile economic recovery we have witnessed to in 2021 and 2022, how fragile is it? And can you comment also on the possibility that with a weak recovery or even a recession, non-performing loans might endanger financial stability? Thank you.
So thank you very much for the invitation to this very distinguished panel. So whether inflation will be brought under control, this will depend on many factors. So right now, for the Western Balkan region, we project inflation to average at around 8.5% for this year, before coming down to just below 5% next year. However, as I said already, this depends on what will happen to the lockdown in China, the Russia-Ukraine war and related implications on commodity prices, the actions by the central bank, but also on the fiscal policy. So many central banks have already started a tightening cycle to control inflation. So for example, some Eastern European countries started already last year with policy rate hikes, and in the Western Balkan region, the central banks started to increase the policy rates in March of this year. What is to be avoided is that inflation becomes broad-based, which we have started to see in the form of increasing core inflation already in many countries. In this regard, early actions by central banks to increase the policy rates and clear communication, also what the governor said before, are very critical. And even if inflation is largely imported and the output gap is negative in several countries. So by taking actions, central banks are sending an important signal to the market that they are committed to maintain price stability. So higher policy rates will not bring down food and energy prices. These are exogenous to the Western Balkan region, but prevent the anchoring of inflation expectations and thus reduce pressures for wage increases and related second-round effects. So, however, a key pillar for central banks being able to fulfill their mandate of bringing the inflation under control is central bank credibility, and this is very closely linked to central bank independence. So central banks are actually currently operating in a very complex environment of high global inflation, a slowing of economies, and financial sector vulnerabilities. So allowing central banks to focus on the primary mandate of preserving price stability is actually the best prerequisite for ensuring macroeconomic stability and future growth. So at the same time, it is also important that fiscal and monetary policy are coordinated. And what do I mean with this? So for example, fiscal policy should be mindful of creating domestic demand pressures or introducing large wage increases, which will actually further increase inflation. At the same time, however, lowering taxes on food and energy products would be a fiscally very costly way of keeping inflation down. Instead, fiscal policy should use well-targeted and temporary support measures that focus on the vulnerable households. Just what Minister Bezzini has pointed out as the government's new priority. So to go over to your second question on the financial sector implications of increasing inflation, increasing interest rates. So we see actually three channels of how the Western Balkan financial systems can actually be impacted by that. One is first the lower growth in the trading partners. This will have mainly impacts on the open economies such as North Macedonia and Serbia, where a large share of the domestic production is being exported to Europe. And then secondly, also due to a compression of real incomes, because wages have not been holding up with inflation, which will reduce the turnover of domestic businesses. The second channel is that most borrowing in the Western Balkan region is actually at variable interest rates or at short maturity. So the cost of higher interest rates will have to be borne actually by the borrowers, and borrowers are normally not hedged against the interest risk. And this is likely to have some implications on non-performing loans, especially when there is an abrupt increase in interest rates. So on top, due to slower deposit growth, what we are seeing now, and thus a tighter liquidity situation in the banking system, access to new financing will be more challenging. The third channel is higher commodity prices and wages have increased operating costs of companies, impacting on their profits. And further, households' debt servicing capacity is reduced because a larger share of their income is being spent on food and energy costs. All of this is likely to have some impact on NPLs. On a positive note, however, NPL ratios in the Western Balkans have been declining since the global financial crisis, which was due to write-offs, improved enforcement mechanism, but also saw an increase in the over-lending. And non-performing loans are now ranging between 2%, it's for Kosovo, and 7% in the region. Further, we have not seen any large increase in non-performing loans following the expiration of the borrower relief measures that were put in place during the pandemic. And in some Western Balkan countries, for example, Albania, there has even been a decline. So nonetheless, the combination of higher interest rates, lower purchasing power, and lower growth is likely to put stress on borrowers. So therefore, for central banks, they will need to closely monitor financial sector vulnerabilities and take supervisory and regulatory measures as needed, and ensure that asset classification and loan loss provisions accurately reflect credit risks and losses. Forward-looking stress testing of the financial systems and contingency planning will be important tools in this regard. So let me stop here because I see the time is over. Handing it back to you.
Also from the IMF, we have a video message from Mr. Luke Dress, Alternate Executive Director. What we asked him was related to the IMF's unique position to observe and assess the macroeconomic policies that are being implemented worldwide. And we asked him, well, focusing on the region of the Western Balkans, where we belong, and having in mind the current economic situation and all the obstacles for the future, what are the most important recommendations that the IMF would like to extend to the Western Balkan countries' fiscal policies? So what is to have in mind, for example, regarding the types of measures, their focus, their duration, etc. And we have a video message, so I would kindly ask the organizers to put it.
Chair, to discuss the recommendation for fiscal policy in Western Balkan countries, I think it's important to recall where we stand today. A strong revenue performance improved public finances across the region in 2021. But the war in Ukraine compounded the policy challenges created by the pandemic, with implications both for public budget and for their financing. On the fiscal and budgetary side, the surging energy and food prices forced government to provide support to households and businesses, and to distressed state-owned companies in the energy sector. Governments also faced demand for higher wage and social transfers, in particular pensions, and faced also higher costs of goods, services, and public investment. Yet, fiscal space has been greatly exhausted by the COVID-19 support, and the already adopted support package requires some countries to rebalance and review their budget as early as in the first quarter of the fiscal year. Now, on the financing side, war-induced geopolitical uncertainties, high inflation, and the prospect of higher interest rates will also create financing challenges. Initially, large inflation surprises in 2021 helped to reduce debt ratios, but as monetary policy entered a tightening cycle to curb inflation, sovereign borrowing costs started to rise. And it is narrowing fiscal space and increased debt vulnerabilities, especially for emerging economies. Western Balkans could also be confronted with refinancing risk. Most countries in the region have been becoming increasingly reliant on external financing, making countries with high debt burdens and limited fiscal space particularly vulnerable. We are already witnessing a sharp increase in sovereign bond spreads in international capital markets. For example, the spread of North Macedonia and Serbia increased by more than 200 basis points since the beginning of the year. And what does this mean in terms of policy recommendations? So the IMF recommends fiscal strategies to be tailored to individual country circumstances. In those economies hard hit by the war in Ukraine, fiscal policy needs to respond to the humanitarian crisis and economic disruptions. Given rising inflation and interest rates, fiscal support should be targeted to those most affected, like vulnerable households, and also targeted to specific priorities areas, including on energy transition and developmental needs. In emerging markets and low-income countries facing tight financing conditions, or even the risk of debt distress, The IMF recommends for the government to prioritize spending and raise revenues to reduce debt vulnerabilities and financial market pressures. Let me expand shortly on this point. First, with limited fiscal space, country will need to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of new spending commitments in response to higher price and many governmental finance measures to limit the impact of rising domestic price, including by cutting taxes or granting subsidies or by generalized transfers to households. And there is a case to be made for such fiscal support, as increased energy and food prices are triggering concern not only about households' income, but also episodes of food shortages and social unrest. However, these measures, of course, are bearing large fiscal costs. The IMF advises therefore to deploy targeted and temporary cash transfer to the most vulnerable. On the contrary, direct energy or food price controls can have undesirable consequences. Actually, not allowing domestic price to adjust to global prices can exacerbate the imbalances between global demand and supply, and putting further pressure on international prices. Second, as other parts of Europe, Western Balkans countries also face environmental and developmental needs. In particular, the current crisis has further underlined the vulnerabilities of the global energy system and the need to diversify energy sources and suppliers towards renewable energy. Climate change is an immediate concern that cannot be relegated to the medium term. There is also an urgent need to considerably scale up global ambitions in action to tackle the climate crisis, for example, by building energy resilience through investing in renewables and energy efficiency. Other public infrastructure needs exist as well. And the current circumstances make the need to carefully manage and prioritize these, taking into consideration the fiscal space and the financing means available. On the revenue side, improving tax compliance and increasing progressivity should be a priority across the Western Balkans. Finally, looking forward, the IMF recommends countries to anchor fiscal sustainability in credible medium-term fiscal consolidations plan. And this is key for buttressing confidence with households, business, and financial investors. So let me stop here. Back to you, Chair. Mr. Chair, as I could not attend the discussion in real time, so let me make a short general conclusion. In the Republic of North Macedonia, in Western Balkan countries, in Europe, and in the rest of the world, finance ministers are confronted with a daunting task. While uncertainty is the highest, the needs are large for the short term, but also for the long term. And however, unfortunately, there is no one fiscal silver bullet under the current circumstances. So let me just repeat that fiscal strategies should be tailored to individual country specificities and should be nimble to adjust to the rapid changing conditions. At the same time, they should be anchored in credible and sustainable medium-term fiscal plans. So dear fellow panelists, dear Minister of Finance, this requires you to be agile, transparent, and consistent when designing and implementing your policies. And I'm sure that you will be up to the task. Thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Next, we turn our attention to Mr. Vladimir Gligorov, Senior Research Associate at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Mr. Gligorov with us online. Mr. Gligorov, welcome to the panel. I hope you can hear us well.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Excellent.
I have the questions for you. Please bear in mind that we have 7 minutes allocated for your answer. You don't see the clock here. Okay, so could I just ask you to comment on recent inflation trends and to share your view on whether inflation is getting out of control, and do you see the inflation we have been witnessing of being of transitory or persistent nature? And also I would like to hear your comment on economic growth in times of very high inflation and expected increases in interest rates. I can see the picture is frozen. I don't know if you heard me or not.
The connection. The connection, maybe. Connection is lost. Maybe here, and meanwhile we get...
Okay, while this is sorted out, we'll go to our next speaker. And this is Mr. Bishop, who is the President of the Council for Education and Strategic Research at the Economic Chamber of North Macedonia. Mr. Bishop, a question for you. How fast do you think that increases in policy interest rates will be transmitted to commercial banks' interest rates? And what impact do you expect it will have on inflation dynamics? And also, if I may add another question, do you think that capital buffers will be sufficient to ensure resilience of the banking systems? Thank you.
Okay, first pleasure being here, and recognition to organizers, especially to Ministry of Finance, that is successful each year, exceeding our expectation, and I wish also next year to overcome our expectation. I will start with a few notions. First, after the COVID crisis, all economic agents are highly indebted. Public sector internationally on average 100%, household sector on average 50%, and company sector on average 100%. And if we compare this with North Macedonia, we should see that on average North Macedonia situation is at least half better. Public sector 52%, household 22, and the same level company sector. Second notion that I would like to share is that in last 20 years, growth of valuation of financial assets and real estate decouple from GDP growth. So wealth of economic agents in a period of 20 years tripled, while GDP growth cumulative internationally was around 30%. And mainly this is due what Nobel Prize winner Krugman mentioned, the term of savings glut or structural stagnation. That means due to demographic and also due to income inequality, propensity to save is significantly higher than propensity to invest. And in such situation, now we are talking what would be the level of interest rates and how much tightening. So central bank, up to now, they committed that they will tighten interest rates on money market, not on capital market. And from that point of view, they also committed second commitment that at least until the end of this year and beginning of next year, they will not shrink their balance sheet. And the liquidity in the economy mainly will remain on that basis the same as it is now. And if we compare what is it now, it is 51% higher the liquidity of company sector in USA than it was before the COVID. In Euro area and Germany, it is 30% higher. And in Macedonia, end of previous year, it was 15% higher. In the first quarter, there was some contraction due to the fact that the central bank has to defend the exchange rate and they were net seller. Most probably it will become in equilibrium. So the message is that from point of view, even there is slowdown and even mild recession, the assessment is that company sector, at least for next 10 to 15 months, will not have big pain. And NPLs and bankruptcy to increase significantly. So from that point of view, yes, there will be pain, there will be NPLs, but there is still sufficient time, policymakers, together with private sector, to manage adequately situation. And connected with this, we are coming to third notion. Although we have high inflation, net interest rates are negative. So even with lower growth, or even with negative growth, when real interest rates are more negative, you can borrow without increasing your indebtedness. Whether this will prevail is difficult to assess. Mainly will depend whether the savings glut will remain, or the new agenda for green economy and zero pollution will create additional investments that will absorb these savings and will require higher interest rates. And my last notion would be, even before crisis, the world was facing the 11 years of permanent economic growth. If we take 2020, that the recession was mainly due to COVID, we are coming 13 years of economic growth, which for private economy is very long cycle. So from that point of view, even today with 3.6% unemployment rate of USA and lowest unemployment rate in Europe, they are overheated. So whether some kind of recession is coming in our surrounding, most probably the answer is yes, even without inflation. Now with the inflation it becomes more complicated because you have simultaneously to tackle two evils. And unfortunately, Macedonia is not overheated in economy. Unemployment rate is 15.2. So we need to have a growth in a period when we have to bring down inflation. So let's hope that important inflationary and recessionary pressures from world economy will be well managed. Banks are well capitalized, have liquidity, also companies have liquidity, and let's hope that the space that remains for monetary policy, because we have pegged exchange rate, and for fiscal side, will contribute this pain to be more moderate. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And last but not least, in this round of questions, we have Mr. Alexander Stoico, Professor of Economics at Cyril and Methodius University here in Skopje. Mr. Stoico, how much should the interest rates rise to curb inflation? And what do you think? Is a more decisive reaction by the central banks needed? And an additional question. We've heard a lot of talks about the return of stagflation. How realistic is this scenario? I know that we heard from our Nobel Prize winner today, he sent a calming message that maybe stagflation will not be such a big problem. But I think even during this panel, we've heard a lot of concerns about the possibility of stagflation. It seems that in some countries, the situation might be somewhat specific.
Thank you very much. It's difficult to give a contribution after such an impressive list of panelists, distinguished panelists, but I can give some summary account of the, a preliminary summary account of the main points. I would say inflation is so high, underscores a friend of mine who earns in the top 1%, that even I felt it. So imagine, as always, the most vulnerable, those on the bottom of the income line will suffer the most. Their consumption basket is primarily consisted of food and energy items, and they will suffer the most from this period. The higher inflation this time does not follow a simple script. That's what we heard today, because it stems from a variety of different sources. Some macroeconomists, let's say like Joseph Stiglitz, argues that the monetary policy may not be the best tool to tackle higher inflation. He underscores that fiscal policy can shoulder part of the burden of the crisis and help with social transfers for the most vulnerable, with some, let's say, tax cuts for essential food products. So there is a significant role for the fiscal policy this time to help the monetary one. This is somewhat radical view, but there are many mainstream economists who believe that the monetary policy should pursue its primary mandate, that it is the art of managing expectations, so it must respond to the higher inflation. And let us remind that Professor Lawrence Summers warned even in February 2021 that inflation is picking up. Even at that time, people had accumulated a lot of savings during the pandemic, and they started to make up for the lost, for the foregone consumption. There is one term now, revenge travel. You want to make a revenge for the lost time during the pandemic. So people would like to make up for the lost time during the crisis. In a nutshell, the inflation started even before the war in Ukraine. It picked up due to the ramp-up demand, due to the fiscal support and monetary stimulus, and also because of supply-side disruptions. And now, as you mentioned, and many discussants underscored, the outlook is clouded by stagflationary risks. In my view, there are three key questions. First, is inflation a temporary or a persistent phenomenon? Second one, what are the main stagflationary risks? And the third one is how do we manage the inflation expectations, whether we go on the monetary side with aggressive rises in the interest rates, or we follow a gradualist approach as ECB, let's say, announced. Professor Krugman mentioned that he is in the camp, in the team transitory. Those economists who believe that problems will be eventually sorted out in the next 18 months, let's say. But also there are prominent economists in the team persistent who argue that the current inflation may fuel higher inflation expectations, and this will be a problem. Regarding the sources of inflation, the stagflationary risks, we heard about the war in Ukraine, we heard about the zero COVID policy in China, the impact of the lockdowns on the supply side, on the transport bottlenecks. Also, someone mentioned about the service inflation, because the price growth of services was subdued in the last 2 years, but now services experience a much stronger growth. Then, a very important phenomenon tackled by academic economists is the defragmentation of the global economy. Sino-American decoupling between Europe and the Russian Federation, those actions will be costly. Also, demographic aging was mentioned because it will put pressure on a reduced supply of labor, backlash among immigrants, etc. So, my conclusion would be that central banks should follow a very gradualist approach in a, that's the academic term, data-dependent way, which implies that they will monitor cautiously what's happening with the core inflation. If the wage price spiral, which is the most important at the moment, is being intensified, then the central bank should go with much aggressive increases in the interest rates. Presently, I fully agree with the approach taken by our central bank and the gradual increase of the key policy rate so that they will have time to adjust to the new situation and to manage the expectations with announcements of the future actions, with some forward guidance, and announcement of the implications of the policies. Thank you.
Thank you for these comments. And I think it was also a nice summary of what we were discussing today. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was informed by the organizers that unfortunately we could not establish a link with their technical problems with Professor Grigorov, so he will not be joining the panel. Before we are right on time, I just at the end would like to ask Mrs. Eble from the IMF a very short question. We know that one of the options for the Macedonian government to finance, let's say, the expenditures this year is by borrowing through the IMF. And the facility is there. Probably it will be one of the several options used. Serbia is using this policy coordination mechanism for, I think, 30 months or something like that. Even they don't need it for balance of payments needs. Apart from the benefits from borrowing at a very low interest rate from the IMF, do you see at this particular, I mean, at this moment with the prevailing circumstances, would you recommend some kind of let's say, instrument like the policy coordination instrument, even when you don't really need it, that it might be beneficial for some reason for other countries apart from Serbia to have something like that in place?
No, thank you for this question. No, the IMF always stands ready to support its member countries. And this policy coordination instrument is particularly aimed at sending a signal to other financiers into the market that there's a policy framework in countries in place that actually provides for sustainable macroeconomic policies. So it's more a signaling effect and also to help to provide sufficient technical assistance to ensure that there's progress in reforms. So yes, we stand always ready to support if there's a request from any member country to explore this option. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have some time, short time for any questions from the audience, if there are any, or comments also. not, please. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a short question. I'm not sure who is going to answer, but it's about fiscal policy. I was wondering, in such challenging times, when we have to cut inflation, and we should also do that most effectively, and on the other side, we have to fight to produce economic growth, what do you think about postponing the progressive income taxation, which has been announced to be in 2023? Wouldn't the progressive taxation be in conflict with the main goals of the fiscal policy that we're governing now, or you think other ways? This could be regional or national approach.
Yeah, thank you.
As you wish. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I was wondering to make a comment before leaving the stage, so thanks. It's an opportunity, just. Because of time limitation, of course, we cannot say everything during our address. Actually, on the approach that we have announced, mainly I was focusing on the expenditure side of the budget, of the fiscal policy. In terms of the revenue side, we have a strategy for reforms in the tax system in the country, with some priorities on fairness of the system, efficiency, transparency, also green fiscal policy. And on the fairness, actually is the part of the progressive income taxation. Actually, we are working on finalizing the concept of tax reforms in the country. And as agreed with the business community, we will come out with an open debate and a 6-month period of introductions once we agree on the concept. The timing is very challenging, and we will make sure that whatever comes will be agreed, and it will be timely, and it will be transitionally or phased approach of introducing this. But definitely we'll make sure that these are based on the figures, on estimated figures and the impacts. So this is what we are playing. It's coming soon in terms of having more sustainable only on the supply side, on the revenue side of the budget, consolidated, that will give us more fiscal space to have for the expenditure side of the budget, and fiscal consolidation, which is our challenge and a plan in midterm. So since I'm still on this 1 minute left, I want just to the point when we see more or less the response from countries, from region, also so colleagues from the region, and also IMF and experts here and governor. Actually, now the addressing the fiscal policy, definitely what we were aiming, the fiscal consolidation will be faster, it will be more moderate, and we will have to be coordinated with the central bank in terms of how we act on the fiscal support. So on the other side, the interest rates that will need to work for the price stability will not have higher and more stressful impact for the private sector. So this is important to work together on this. So I just want at the end to say that we keep communication with the private sector, and also the communication is very critical of the credibility and effectiveness of the measures that we are undertaking, not only the right ones, but also to be properly communicated and timely. So thank you.
Okay, then I guess we came to the end of this panel. We would like to thank all the distinguished panelists for their participation, and also the audience for the attention. The next item on the agenda for this event, the organizers are cordially inviting you for lunch. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention. We will continue after the lunch break.